Welcome to this edition of Legislative Report. I'm Anthony Tezak. On January 13th, legislators returned to Harrisburg to kick off the 2014 session of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. As they gathered, new projections from the Department of Revenue indicated the Commonwealth will face a budget shortfall of $1.4 billion. Here to discuss the fiscal challenges that lie ahead for lawmakers and to offer a glimpse at the issues that will likely come before the legislature this year is State Representative Ryan Mackenzie. Representative, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Anthony. And as you mentioned, we do have some tough fiscal times ahead, but I look forward to talking about them and working through those problems over the course of this year and making sure that we get another budget passed successfully on time with no tax increases for Pennsylvanians.
So why don't we get right into it? As of the date of this taping, the governor has not yet given his budget address to the General Assembly. So you can't obviously get into the full details of his plan. But from what we understand, there is a pretty massive shortfall. And if I'm correct, a lot of that comes from the pensions. Can you speak on that for a little bit?
That's correct. So last year we had a $28.4 billion budget here in Pennsylvania. And this year we are facing a $1.4 billion shortfall. And what that means is even though revenue is projected to be slightly over what it was last year, our costs are exceeding those revenue increases by $1.4 billion. And as you mentioned, a significant portion of that comes from the increasing costs in our pension system. We have two pensions systems here in Pennsylvania, PSERS and SERS. Those relate to Pennsylvania state employees and also the teachers here in Pennsylvania. So two separate pension funds and really a huge problem in the driving cost in our budget this year.
So exactly how do we get to this point of being so far behind?
Yeah, you know, and before we go on to that, let's talk about the magnitude of this problem. So it's actually the unfunded liability that we have in those pension systems is almost $50 billion.
Wow.
And so again, we just talked about the size of the overall budget being last year $28.4 billion. And so the unfunded liability is $50 billion in these two pension systems. And so how we got there, it was really three different things that came together, confluence that we would almost say it's a perfect storm. And so the first is that legislatures in the past were very irresponsible. Back in 2001, they increased their pension the benefits that would be received without increasing the contributions. And they did that for state employees and for themselves, sometimes to the tune of 25–50% increases. And also, they made those increases retroactive to the start date for employees. And they asked, again, for no further contributions. So anybody who was in the system as a teacher or a state employee up until that point would receive credit for all of those previous years of service at the increased rate of benefits, again, without paying in. So that was a huge cost. The second thing is just the markets, certainly have gone through a volatile time here in the 2000s after the 9/11 attacks, and also after the 2008 financial crisis. We saw a big drop in the investments that were in that pension fund. And then the third thing is that for the years, about 10 years up until 2010, the state was not making their contributions to the pension system. So again, very irresponsible. And since the Republicans took office in 2011 here in Pennsylvania, we have made those contributions, and we're dedicated and committed to making those contributions going forward. But what that does is it does place a strain on the actual budget every year. And so that's where some of the pressure has come from over the years, but it is the responsible thing to do to make sure that we make those payments so that retirees and future employees are going to have their benefits there when they need them and when they want them. And that's a commitment that we've made to those retirees, so we want to make sure we're fulfilling our commitment.
I just want to make sure people at home listening understand this. So for the past 10 years, the previous administration and the legislature underfunded the pensions for 10 years.
That's correct. It was a bipartisan problem. Both parties were a part of it, but under those 8 years of Ed Rendell, they were not making their payments like they should have been. And that put us in a big bind and a hole. And again, with those other factors, it's led us to being underfunded by $50 billion in our pension system.
But now with Governor Rendell out of the picture, new legislature and new leadership, we are now no longer underfunding, correct?
That's correct. So we are making our contributions that we are supposed to be making on an annual basis. But again, we're just so far behind that that's how we got to that unfunded liability of $50 billion. billion. But we are making the payments that we're supposed to be making on an annual basis, and we do have to make reforms going forward to make sure that that system, again, is solvent and there for those retirees and the current employees who have been promised those benefits already.
All right, so you mentioned reform, and that's a big issue for the past couple of years in all aspects here in the Capitol. But pension reform is something that's been talked about a lot over the past couple of months and really past couple of years. What kind of reforms do you see being addressed this session?
That's great. You know, pension reform is a top ticket item here in Pennsylvania this year. It's going to be one of the 2 or 3 big things that we hopefully tackle this session. But I think the first thing that I need to state at the very top before we go into the reforms is that none of the proposals that have been discussed would make any changes for current retirees. And so that is a very important point. There's been a lot of misinformation, confusion out there. So no changes for current retirees. So that needs to be made perfectly clear. There are other proposals out there that would make changes, such as shifting new employees to a 401k style plan, doing some of that backfilling in terms of the underfunding for the past 10 years. There have been proposals that would issue pension obligation bonds to refund and refill that hole that was created by the underfunding from the state. There are other proposals out there that would shift to different hybrid types of plans, which get a little bit more complicated, but they have some merit to them. And then there are other, more simple things out there. So things like anti-spiking provisions. Unfortunately, it's one of the provisions of our current pension system is that people's pension is calculated on the last 3 years. And so what a lot of people do is they'll work a lot of overtime in those last 3 years of their employment and spike their pensions up to a higher level. And that's not really the way the system was designed to be used. And so making changes like that, eliminating that, would save certainly a good amount of money. And also other changes for new employees would certainly help us close the door so that we could really wrap our hands and arms around the problem and then start managing it going forward. Again, we're making those payments on an annual basis, and if we could close that gate or get a handle on it, make reforms going forward, I think we could get ourselves out of this mess.
Now, 2013 was a very successful year for the Republican-controlled legislature. Finally, after many years, we were able to pass a transportation bill. So with a successful 2013, what other issues do you expect to tackle this year to make it just as successful as last year?
Sure. I think there are a lot of issues on the agenda. I always like to look at things and talk about things in 4 different buckets that I prioritize and focus on. So creating jobs, helping taxpayers, strengthening education, and also reforming government. And I was successful in passing 2 bills last year that helped reform the tax code and also clean up a wasteful department here in Pennsylvania. And I have 2 more bills on the agenda. One is a piece of legislation called Career Bound. What that would do is it's a workforce development initiative whereby businesses could donate. They would receive a tax credit for their contribution, and then the funding that would be received from those contributions would go specifically for workforce development and career awareness programs for middle school and high school students. So really helping strengthen our education system and then also getting them prepared for jobs of the future. And so we want to make sure that we have a strong workforce here in Pennsylvania to make sure that our businesses are doing well, but also that our community is doing well. So that's one piece of legislation I'm working on. And then a second one that I have is increasing the penalties for stealing from a municipality or nonprofit entity. And so far too common across Pennsylvania, we see people stealing money from the public trust, and when they do that, they're stealing from everybody or large groups of people, not just one entity. And so I really think that's a very egregious breach of trust. And so we're looking to strengthen or increase the penalties, the criminal penalties for thefts like that. So those are just 2 things that I'm working on, but there are a lot of other things on the agenda this year in addition.
Now, before we go, one other piece of legislation that has everyone talking for the past couple of years is liquor privatization. We weren't able to get it done last year. Do you think we're going to be able to get it done this year? I think we're going to see some more action on that front. We passed in the House the liquor privatization bill. I voted for it. I think it's something that its time has come here in Pennsylvania. We are one of only 2 states in the entire country that still has a full monopolistic control on liquor. It's just us in Utah. And so, I think for a long time, the state control of liquor made a lot of sense when you were specifically, the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board was specifically focused on controlling and regulating access to alcohol.
but there's been a shift recently, and I think a lot of people have seen it, where now the Liquor Control Board is actually promoting alcohol. They're doing a lot more advertising of the stores, trying to increase revenue and saying that they're increasing sales and bringing more revenue into the state. And so really, there's a conflict of interest there, in my opinion. On one hand, the government's regulating and controlling the sale of alcohol, trying to make sure that our communities are safe. And then on the other hand, they're out there promoting alcohol and trying to push it and advertise for increased sales and drinking. So again, that's a conflict, in my opinion, one that government should no longer be involved in. And so I think we should get out of that business. And I think obviously we want to maintain the control element of it, and that would be maintained in state government. So privatization would really just hand over the sale of alcohol. And as we see, beer is sold privately by private individuals across the state, and they are very heavily regulated, and so that access is controlled. And so I think we could do the same thing, just like 48 other states have done, and privatize the sale of wine and spirits. And so I think the Senate has certainly shown an increased interest in doing something on that front this year. And again, this session, we have a lot on our plate, but hopefully that's one of the things that we're going to get done.
All right, Representative Mackenzie, thank you so much for joining us, and good luck this year as you have a lot on your plate.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me.
All right. That's all the time we have for today's program. If you have any questions about what you've just seen or any state government-related matter, Representative Mackenzie's contact information will be on the screen in just a moment. Thanks for watching, and please join us again next time for another edition of Legislative Report.